This story consists of two parts. The Haunted Doll's House. Part 1. James. I suppose you get stuff of that kind through your hands pretty often, said Mr. Dillett, as he pointed with his stick to an object which shall be described when the time comes, and when he said it, he lied in his throat, and knew that he lied. Not once in 20 years, perhaps not once in a lifetime, could Mr. Chittenden, skilled as he was in ferreting out the forgotten treasures of half a dozen counties, expect to handle such a specimen. It was collector's palaver, and Mr. Chittenden recognized it as such. Stuff of that kind, Mr. Dillett. It's a museum piece, that is. Well, I suppose there are museums that'll take anything. I've seen one, not as good as that, years back, said Mr. Chittenden thoughtfully. But that's not likely to come into the market, and I'm told they avenue some fine ones of the period over the water. No, I'm only telling you the truth, Mr. Dillett, when I say that if you was to place an unlimited order with me for the very best that could be got, and you know I avenue facilities for getting to know of such things, and a reputation to maintain, well, all I can say is, I should lead you straight up to that one and say, I can't do no better for you than that, sir. Here, said Mr. Dillett, applauding ironically with the end of his stick on the floor of the shop. How much are you sticking the innocent American buyer for it, eh? Oh, I shan't be over hard on the buyer, American or otherwise. You see, it stands this way, Mr. Dillett, if I knew just a bit more about the pedigree, or just a bit less, Mr. Dillett put in. Ha, you will have your joke, sir. No, but as I was saying, if I knew just a little more than what I do about the piece, though anyone can see for themselves it's a genuine thing, every last corner of it, and there's not been one of my men allowed to so much as touch it since it came into the shop, there'd be another figure in the price I'm asking. And what's that, 5 and 20? Multiply that by 3 and you've got it, sir. 75's my price. And 50's mine, said Mr. Dillett. The point of agreement was, of course, somewhere between the two, it does not matter exactly where, I think 60 guineas. But half an hour later the object was being packed, and within an hour Mr. Dillett had called for it in his car and driven away. Mr. Chittenden, holding the check in his hand, saw him off from the door with smiles, and returned, still smiling, into the parlor where his wife was making the tea. He stopped at the door. It's gone, he said. Thank God for that, said Mrs. Chittenden, putting down the teapot. Mr. Dillett, was it? Yes, it was. We won I'd sooner it was him than another. Oh, I don't know. He ain't a bad feller, my dear. Maybe not, but in my opinion he'd be none the worse for a bit of a shake-up. Well, if that's your opinion, it's my opinion he's put himself into the way of getting one. Anyhow, we shan't have no more of it, and that's something to be thankful for. And so Mr. and Mrs. Chittenden sat down to tea. And what of Mr. Dillett and of his new acquisition? What it was, the title of this story will have told you. What it was like, I shall have to indicate as well as I can. There was only just room enough for it in the car, and Mr. Dillett had to sit with the driver. He had also to go slow, for though the rooms of the doll's house had all been stuffed carefully with soft cotton wool, jolting was to be avoided, in view of the immense number of small objects which thronged them. And the 10-mile drive was an anxious time for him, in spite of all the precautions he insisted upon. At last his front door was reached, and Collins, the butler, came out. Look here, Collins, you must help me with this thing, it's a delicate job. We must get it out upright, see. It's full of little things that mustn't be displaced more than we can help. Let's see, where shall we have it? After a pause for consideration, Really, I think I shall have to put it in my own room, to begin with at any rate. On the big table, that's it. It was conveyed, with much talking, to Mr. Dillett's spacious room on the first floor, looking out on the drive. The sheeting was unwound from it, and the front thrown open, and for the next hour or two Mr. Dillett was fully occupied in extracting the padding and setting in order the contents of the rooms. When this thoroughly congenial task was finished, I must say that it would have been difficult to find a more perfect and attractive specimen of a doll's house in Strawberry Hill Gothic than that which now stood on Mr. Dillett's large knee-hole table, lighted up by the evening sun which came slanting through 3 tall sash windows. It was quite 6 feet long, including the chapel or oratory which flanked the front on the left as you faced it, and the stable on the right. The main block of the house was, as I have said, in the Gothic manner, that is to say, the windows had pointed arches and were surmounted by what are called ogival hoods, with crockets and finials such as we see on the canopies of tombs built into church walls. At the angles were absurd turrets covered with arched panels. The chapel had pinnacles and buttresses, and a bell in the turret and colored glass in the windows. When the front of the house was open you saw 4 large rooms, bedroom, dining room, drawing room and kitchen, each with its appropriate furniture in a very complete state. The stable on the right was in 2 stories, with its proper complement of horses, coaches and grooms, and with its clock and Gothic cupola for the clock bell. Pages, of course, might be written on the outfit of the mansion, how many frying pans, how many gilt chairs, what pictures, carpets, chandeliers, 4 posters, table linen, glass, crockery and plate it possessed. But all this must be left to the imagination. I will only say that the base or plinth on which the house stood, for it was fitted with one of some depth which allowed of a flight of steps to the front door and a terrace, partly balustraded, contained a shallow drawer or drawers in which were neatly stored sets of embroidered curtains, changes of raiment for the inmates, and, in short, all the materials for an infinite series of variations and refittings of the most absorbing and delightful kind. Quintessence of Horace Walpole, that's what it is, he must have had something to do with the making of it. Such was Mr. Dillett's murmured reflection as he knelt before it in a reverent ecstasy. Simply wonderful. This is my day and no mistake. £500 coming in this morning for that cabinet which I never cared about, and now this tumbling into my hands for a tenth, at the very most, of what it would fetch in town. Well, well, it almost makes one afraid something'll happen to counter it. Let's have a look at the population, anyhow. Accordingly, he set them before him in a row. Again, here is an opportunity, which some would snatch at, of making an inventory of costume. I am incapable of it. There were a gentleman and lady, in blue satin and brocade respectively. There were 2 children, a boy and a girl. There was a cook, a nurse, a footman, and there were the stable servants, 2 postilions, a coachman, 2 grooms. Anyone else? Yes, possibly. The curtains of the 4-poster in the bedroom were closely drawn round all 4 sides of it, and he put his finger in between them and felt in the bed. He drew the finger back hastily, for it almost seemed to him as if something had, not stirred, perhaps, but yielded, in an odd live way as he pressed it. Then he put back the curtains, which ran on rods in the proper manner, and extracted from the bed a white-haired old gentleman in a long linen night-dress and cap, and laid him down by the rest. The tale was complete. Dinner time was now near, so Mr. Dillett spent but 5 minutes in putting the lady and children into the drawing room, the gentleman into the dining room, the servants into the kitchen and stables, and the old man back into his bed. He retired into his dressing room next door, and we see and hear no more of him until something like 11 o'clock at night. His whim was to sleep surrounded by some of the gems of his collection. The big room in which we have seen him contained his bed, bath, wardrobe, and all the appliances of dressing were in a commodious room adjoining, but his four-poster, which itself was a valued treasure, stood in the large room where he sometimes wrote, and often sat, and even received visitors. Tonight he repaired to it in a highly complacent frame of mind. There was no striking clock within earshot, none on the staircase, none in the stable, none in the distant church tower. Yet it is indubitable that Mr. Dillett was startled out of a very pleasant slumber by a bell-tolling one. He was so much startled that he did not merely lie breathless with wide-open eyes, but actually sat up in his bed. He never asked himself, till the morning hours, how it was that, though there was no light at all in the room, the doll's house and the knee-hole table stood out with complete clearness. But it was so. The effect was that of a bright harvest moon shining full on the front of a big white stone mansion, a quarter of a mile away it might be, and yet every detail was photographically sharp. There were trees about it too, trees rising behind the chapel and the house. He seemed to be conscious of the scent of a cool still September night. He thought he could hear an occasional stamp and clink from the stables, as of horses stirring. And with another shock he realized that, above the house, he was looking, not at the wall of his room with its pictures, but into the profound blue of a night sky. There were lights, more than one, in the windows, and he quickly saw that this was no four-roomed house with a movable front, but one of many rooms, and staircases, a real house, but seen as if through the wrong end of a telescope. "You mean to show me something," he muttered to himself, and he gazed earnestly on the lighted windows. They would in real life have been shuttered or curtained, no doubt, he thought, but, as it was, there was nothing to intercept his view of what was being transacted inside the rooms. Two rooms were lighted, one on the ground floor to the right of the door, one upstairs, on the left, the first brightly enough, the other rather dimly. The lower room was the dining room, a table was laid, but the meal was over, and only wine and glasses were left on the table. The man of the blue satin and the woman of the brocade were alone in the room, and they were talking very earnestly, seated close together at the table, their elbows on it, every now and again stopping to listen, as it seemed. Once he rose, came to the window and opened it and put his head out and his hand to his ear. There was a lighted taper in a silver candlestick on a sideboard. When the man left the window he seemed to leave the room also, and the lady, taper in hand, remained standing and listening.